I thought I'd give a little bit of overview and kind of about the overall approach and the structure of the model and kind of the steps. And then if we have time, I thought I could walk you guys through like an exercise of kind of just doing a basic kind of interaction with a part, kind of having each of you do it. Like I'll do a guided exercise and have you just imagine going through it with yourself. And then we can kind of debrief from that. So we can kind of see if that all fits in or how it goes. But maybe to start with, how many of you feel like you kind of have a pretty good foundation in parts therapy? Just a little bit for a few of you. Okay. All right. A wee bit. Okay. Well, I'll just assume that people know almost nothing and proceed from there, and we can hopefully get into both, no questions are too silly or superficial or too deep and sophisticated. We'll kind of see where we go. So just parts therapy has become like a new area of excitement for me, new in the last 5 years, in that I kind of have always claimed that narrative therapy is my favorite model and the one I kind of go to when things get tough. And I have found that there's things about parts therapy. There's lots about parts therapy that align with narrative therapy, but there's also some ideas from it that I have found to be a real helpful addition to what narrative therapy can offer. And so I've gotten just more invested in really learning it and using it more. So some of the key stuff, I mean, the basic idea is that, oh, here's Guy. Good. Invite him in. Okay. Guy, we're just getting started with an overview of parts therapy. And so the basic idea is that we're all multiple personalities in not the pathologizing sense of the word, but the positive sense of the word, in that I think we can all relate to that kind of idea that a part of me is really busy, 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 and a part of me can be real chill, or a part of me, when I get angry, gets very assertive or can be a bully, and a part of me can be a pleaser or caretaker. So we all just have these different parts, and they tend to show up in different situations. And the idea in parts therapy is that that's not a bad thing. It's actually really helpful for us to be able to have our professional part that shows up and gets us through a meeting, and our intimate parts that show up and can be soft and connecting to our loved ones. And so it's a fine thing to have different kind of parts, and like a part can have like a little bit of a personality, in the sense that there's feelings that go with the part. Some parts maybe feel and there's thoughts and beliefs. Like some parts might feel like the world is unsafe and I need to be really, prickly to keep myself safe. And another part might feel like the appeasing and pleasing people is the best strategy for making myself belong. So different parts can have very different strategies, different belief systems, different feelings, different urges and behaviors. And in some ways, this is partly why we kind of all tend to be a little bit of a mystery to ourselves, is that we can be so much a certain way in a certain situation, and then a totally different way in a different situation. Or we can feel like really clear that we're not going to do X, Y, Z. And then when we get in a certain situation, that part kind of takes over, we get captured by it, and we do X, Y, Z. And we think, damn, I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore. But once a part gets triggered, it can kind of take over. And one of the things about parts therapy is this idea that there are no bad parts, and that we need to welcome our parts and try to understand them, with an appreciation that our parts are always trying to help us, that they're like coping strategies or defenses, or ways of just handling different situations that they have a sense to them. But often it seems a little bit irrational, because the part often has an extreme set of beliefs and strategies that came out of trauma. So some of our parts, like if I have a part that thinks I have to please people all the time, or that as soon as people look a little angry, I need to please them, that maybe showed up when I had an angry parent who I could only stay in their good graces if I switched to being very pleasing when they got angry. Um, so what happens is that those parts can show up later in life and make us behave as if the past is still true. And so that even though now it's actually safe to be assertive, our part thinks it's not. And our part has us still behaving in these kind of extreme ways. And so some of the reasons that parts become a little dysfunctional at times is that they're burdened with trauma, that they came out of trauma and they're still burdened with some of the beliefs that came out of trauma. And as a result, they're more extreme than they need to be. And so sometimes parts aren't as flexible, adaptive, kind of up to date on the present moment. They're living more in the past, or they're kind of rigid. And that what parts therapy is about is trying to help the parts become less extreme, so that we're not trying to get rid of them, but we're recognizing that our whole system can work together much more effectively if our parts have a little more flexibility, or that if in fact our parts are driven by an old story that's no longer true, that the part learns that that story is no longer true and becomes a little bit more updated and informed about the present day reality. So we have this kind of basic understanding that we're all made out of parts, and we have this basic assumption that parts are welcome and that we want to relate to them with appreciation for the fact that they have good intentions. And those two ideas in combination, that we all have parts, that's normal, and also that we can appreciate them and relate to them with some recognition that they have good intentions, or trying to protect us or keep us safe. Those two ideas work together to make us be able to relate to our parts in a way that is consistent with trauma treatment, in the sense that it allows, when we see a part, as opposed to it just being who we are, we can have a relationship with that part, and we can kind of externalize it or see it as something that we're trying to tend to. And so it allows us to have that kind of dual consciousness. And especially if we can stay in a place of being compassionate and curious towards the part, we're bringing that kind of ingredient that heals trauma, which is about being able to be present for the trauma without being in it, being able to show up with that kind of compassionate witness, curiosity, and care that enables us to begin to understand it and help it. So that's kind of the relationship that we're trying to help our clients have with their parts. And one of the other kind of core ideas that comes out of parts therapy is that every client is equipped with a self, a kind of core self that is the agent of healing, and that the therapist doesn't have to do the healing. The therapist's job is to help the client access self and use self to do the healing. And so self is this kind of, what does it look like when I'm the most grounded, the most wise, the most kind of evolved, or even transcendent? And so they've used this description of what is called the 8 C's to describe core self. And the C's stand for caring, compassionate, clarity, connection, courage, creativity, confidence, and something else. I never can remember the courage. I don't know if I said courage. Anyway, that we have these qualities, and there's lots of P words and other C words and all kinds of other words that could describe it. But I think we all kind of know that feeling when we're in our best self and we're feeling like this sense of equanimity and a sense of perspective. In some ways, you could kind of think of it as mirroring polyvagal theory, for any of you who are used to that idea, which is that we have this kind of safe and engaged part of our brain that is like the core self, that is our more of our prefrontal lobe, just the best of our humanity that can show up and offer compassion and perspective. And then we have these triggered states that are a little bit more limbic, that can be more rigid, more emotional, more artifacts of the past. And that in parts therapy, the lovely idea is that we use ourself, our core self, to help tend to understand, update, and heal the parts. And so it's kind of a nice idea that we're all equipped with self, and that even, Richard Schwartz, who was the founder of parts therapy, or he calls it IFS, internal family systems, because he was a family therapist, and he began to kind of recognize that people have these kind of families of parts inside of themselves. But Richard Schwartz really emphasizes the idea that we all have this core self, and that really it's mostly a matter of clearing what gets in the way of it. And that once you can kind of get all the parts out of the way, that self is kind of there in a reliable way for almost everyone, even if they've been pretty severely traumatized or didn't get their attachment needs met as a child. It seems almost like it's part of the human evolutionary condition that we're capable of perspective taking and love and connectivity and all of those C's. And so it's kind of a lovely thing to kind of discover that even people who have been pretty damaged have that wise part that we can help them to access. So those are some of the basic ideas. And then one of the things that's kind of helpful is this concept that there's types of parts. And let me just put this graphic up for you, because I think it would help you to see what I'm talking about. So can you guys see this? So this is a map of kind of how parts, different categories of parts. And in parts therapy, there's this core self that has these 8 C's that I described, that's there to kind of be the hub of our system. And when we're functioning well, we feel very kind of grounded in that core self. And when parts show up, we're able to use them for their, extra, like I have a busy part or a caretaking part, and those parts are all useful as long as they kind of are in connection with my core self, and they're operating more based on present day reality and not based on some old story. So ideally, our system is like a hub of parts around a very present and vibrant core self. But very often what happens is we get lost in each part as they come up. And there's these 3 kinds of parts, 2 categories of protector parts and exile parts. And exile parts are like the, why did that, sorry. I don't know why this little bar comes up there, disappeared. So protector parts also have 2 subcategories. So there's managers and firefighters. And some of you have heard these parts described. Basically, there's kind of 3 names that you hear: manager parts, firefighter parts, and exile parts. And that managers and firefighters are both types of protectors. And what that means is they show up to try to protect us from the vulnerabilities that we've experienced in our life and the wounds, the exiles. And so the exiles are old wounds, old traumas that, I'm sorry, this keeps happening. If I bring my cursor down to the bottom, I get that bar and then it doesn't disappear for a while, but I'll try not to make that happen again. So the exiles are things like pain, shame, fear, unlivability, loneliness, anger, need. They get triggered whenever we get reminded of an earlier time in our life, or something kind of makes us feel unsafe or unloved. And that a lot of our lives are spent, our defenses and our parts or our coping strategies have to do with never wanting to feel that way again, or never wanting to have these experiences again. So our system is set up to protect us from these exiled feelings that come from old trauma. And so we have these old traumatized parts but we also have all these coping strategy parts. And they kind of, the protectors have two basic categories, and managers are more proactive. They're trying to keep us from getting into situations or having feelings that would cause us to feel those exiled, awful feelings of loneliness or fear or shame. And so they do things like striving, caretaking, denying, cheerleading, worrying, all of these different strategies to keep us from having to get into those situations. And then we have these firefighter parts. And those are a little bit more reactive in the sense that they show up when we've already been triggered. The exiles are showing up. We're feeling the exiled feeling of pain, shame, fear, anger, rage. And the firefighter shows up to try to extinguish it as quickly as it can. So prevention is no longer an option. It's happened. And we go into a different kind of strategy, which tends to be a little more extreme. And so firefighters are the parts that, binge, drink, or eat, to do self-mutilization or suicidality, have, raging or really destructive things. One way to think of a firefighter is it's kind of like a take no prisoners, doesn't matter what kind of damage you do. It's like the house is on fire. We're going to do whatever we can to put it out, even if it means breaking down the door, breaking all the china in the house, spraying water everywhere. We're going to do whatever we can to put out the fire. And that's what these kind of firefighter habits and behaviors and parts are about, is putting out the fire. And for those of us who, a lot of us do have firefighters that are pretty destructive, and that we can rage and do things that we regret later, or we can, certainly get into substance abuse and food abuse or whatever. But, our firefighter might just be compulsive binge watching of a TV show. It's like, I'm having unbearable feelings of loneliness and I wasn't able to prevent them. And now I just have to find a way to kind of calm my hijacked system down. And the best way is to go numb or to distract myself. But I didn't prevent it. It happened. So that's the firefighter part. Sometimes you can't tell the difference. They're kind of a mix of both. Like I have a busy distractor part that kind of tries to keep me busy all the time. It helps me feel like I belong in the world. It keeps my exiles from showing up, which are about feeling lost and unconnected and like I don't belong. But the busy part can show up right when I get like I'm missing out on something, like I didn't get to, my plane got canceled and I didn't get to go to a reunion with my siblings that I was really looking forward to. And I'm already feeling loneliness or disconnection in a way that's painful. And I get really busy doing something as a way to cope with that. So that would be the busyness being more of a firefighter. But sometimes the busyness is more of a manager. By staying busy, I create an experience for myself of belonging in the world or being important or having things to do that make me think that I belong or that I'm good or something. One of the things that you can do is to actually map out your whole system and start to identify what are some of the core exiles and what are some of the common protectors that show up and the common firefighters. And so just to show you an example of that, let me stop sharing my screen. I'm just going to hold this up and it might be kind of hard to see, but just to kind of show you an example of this. So I put down my core exile as kind of this little lost one or little lost Susie feeling that I feel like a little 4-year-old who's a neglected child, which I had a lot of experiences of being kind of untended to as a child. So that's the core feeling that I don't want to have again, or not being valued by my family. And it has kind of little subcategories, like there's a just a lonely, unmoored, kind of untethered feeling. And there's an ashamed feeling of unlovability. And there's also just a fear feeling of like, I'm afraid I'm under-equipped, I don't know how to manage, and I don't have anyone taking care of me. So any one of those is kind of like an exile. It's very old. I feel very little. I feel about 4 or 2 when I feel those feelings. And then I have these managers. This is the heart's supposed to represent my core self that's kind of always there to help. But my manager strategies are being an ambitious achiever, being a worrier, being busy, a pretender who, kind of poses, a pleaser. And this is more of kind of probably a firefighter to distract and avoid and numb out. So those would be just different strategies I use to handle these feelings, to keep these feelings from showing up. There's also something called concern parts, which I'll get into in a minute. And those are the parts that show up when you're trying to focus on a part and help it, but another part kind of gets in the way. And so that, for me, that's like a skeptic that doesn't believe there's anything to be done that's going to help, or an intellectualizer that keeps it all very intellectual and doesn't let me get into the feelings part of it, or a sleepy kind of disassociated feeling that can show up when I start trying to tackle some of my internal stuff. So that's just an example of a map of my system. So why don't we pause for some questions at this point, because I've thrown out a lot, and I'm curious about what kinds of things are showing up for people as you hear all this.
Sort of feel like up to this point, this is stuff that you have sort of explained before, but it's a little more in depth, and it's really helpful. I think that handout, I'm like, oh, I can see like a million ways that I could use that and make, sort of the points that I'm trying to share with clients a lot more clear and streamlined.
I'll send you a copy of that so that you can use it with clients. Yeah.
I guess my question is, just thinking in relation to the example you gave for yourself, like, I don't know if I really have formed my question yet, but just trying to think about strategies to help clients identify with the exile. Like, what is it? Like, what is the thing I'm trying to avoid? Like, I have a client who is regularly raging to her partner in this kind of thing that they're going through right now, and is just filled with feelings of shame around it and regret and guilt, but we're struggling to tap into like where it's coming from. So I don't really know.
No, that's a great question, and I'm going to go into that more in a minute, but just to give you a little sense of that, there's a core question that we ask a protector, so that she's got this raging protector that shows up when she feels threatened or rejected or whatever that is. And when the rage shows up, it's trying to protect her from something, but you don't really know what. You're trying to understand, what is that little wounded thing that this protector is trying to protect her from. And one way to get at it is to ask her. One of the things that we try to do with our clients is we have them talk to their parts. And so, you might have her closing her eyes and just picturing that the parts in front of her, the rage, and she's asking the rage what it's trying to accomplish. Like, what is it wants to make sure happens? How is it trying to protect her? What's it concerned about? But one of what they call the key question that we ask that gets at the exile is, what's the rage afraid would happen if it stopped doing its job? So if that part wasn't around doing its job, what's it afraid would happen? And it's amazing how often the part has a pretty clear answer to that. Like, you would get squelched, or everybody would fuck with you, or, whatever it is.
You'd be forgotten.
And so then you can explore that if the client's ready. Like, when has that happened in your life? I would imagine, that's happened before, where you didn't have the rage as a tool and you got totally decimated by something that someone did. And so, and then you can kind of explore that, and we can talk more about ways to explore that and how to get ready for that, to do that. A couple important things. The other thing you could ask is, what circumstances, when did that rage first occur? When do you remember it first showing up for you? And what was the circumstances under which it showed up? So that's another way to get at that. But one of the premises of parts therapy is you don't go to the exile until the protector is giving you permission. And so if you like try to get past the rage and work on her vulnerability and her exiled feelings before she wants to, what often happens is the exile parts amplify, because they're there to try to keep her from having the enfeebled feelings or the lonely feelings or the fragile feelings. And so you're trying to just go right into the fragile feelings, and her system doesn't think that's safe yet. Her system doesn't understand that they're not happening anymore and that she really is safe from them, and you're just trying to process them from afar. And if her system doesn't understand that, then she's going to go even more ballistic with the rage, or maybe some other protector will show up and she'll leave the session and try to kill herself or drive off the road, or, go get high when she's been in recovery for, 2 months. And so we're likely to trigger a stronger protector if we go to an exile without making sure that we've gotten permission from the protector, and that the protector gets it, that we're going to keep the person safe and the person knows how to keep themselves safe. So that's a good segue into talking about kind of the steps of how you enter into this work, and some of the things that are useful to do in a certain order. And it doesn't have to be exactly that way. I mean, I so much will just do a little piece of this and sometimes in a different order, but there's certain things about knowing these steps that can be very helpful. So just to basically describe it, and then I'll show you a handout that kind of goes over it to help you. But the basic idea is that you start by getting to know a protector. And often the protectors are what people come to therapy for, like they are having an anger problem, or they feel controlling towards everybody, or they notice that they can't find their voice and they're being sub-assertive. And so those are parts, that are protective. They're trying to protect them from something else. The pleaser is trying to protect them from getting rejected or attacked, and whatever each part is trying. So people often come to therapy because they want help with a part or a defensive behavior that's causing them trouble. Sometimes they come because they know they have this core trauma that they need to work through, but more often they don't start with that. They start with being frustrated with themselves or with their situation, and then you start kind of unraveling that system. But the idea is that we want to start by getting to know the protectors and getting their permission before we go to the exiles. And that what we want to do is work with the protector to help soften it, help it be less extreme, help it to feel the self, feel a trusted relationship with the self, and be more able to behave with the capacities that the current self has, instead of just this very small collection of capacities. One way to think about it is that, like when I was 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, I don't remember those early times, but I had a mother who didn't want to be a mother and was depressed and anxious and very distracted. She had 3 children under the age of 4, and then a 4th that came along not too long after that. I think when my sister was 7, she had her 4th child, and so my older sister. And so we were all pretty young and overwhelming, and she had a husband who was in medical school, moving from city to city, doing his residencies and internships, and she didn't have friends or family around. And so she was in a pretty bad situation and not being able to be very present for us. And my father was very busy and not very present for us. And so I had this little part of me that felt like I didn't really belong, and I didn't really think I was safe. And so I felt like there was a lot of things I needed to figure out in the world, but I had no idea how to. And so often we get these kind of core experiences when we're very young, and then a little bit later, not too much later, a coping strategy develops. But it's often very young too, just not quite as young. So maybe around 6 or 7, I learned how to, or probably around 4, I learned how to be really sparkly and interesting and enthusiastic, and good at attaching to anyone who would let me attach to them. And that those qualities helped me feel like I belonged. They helped me feel more secure. And when I was around 6 or 7, I developed a strategy of worrying. I was anxious about everything. I had kind of separation anxiety, and I was clinging really hard to my mom, and I was afraid of things. And one of the ways I dealt with it is I would worry, like I would obsess about, do I have my coat for school? Do I need a lunch? What are we doing? Are we going on a field trip? Do I know what bus am I supposed to ride? And so I had this kind of very under-equipped worrier that was trying to keep me safe. It was a little 7-year-old trying to manage all the things that a mom should be managing. And that part of me, now when I think about my worrier part, it feels about 7 or 8. And instead of using all the skills I have, which are like, make a list of what I need to do, figure out, who I could ask for help. Like there's lots of things I can do when I'm facing a stressful situation that are much more skilled than the 7-year-old strategies. But what usually shows up is the 7-year-old strategies, which is just worry about it over and over again and get a look on your face like you're worried about it. So this is the problem with a lot of our parts, is even though they're trying to help us, they're barely older than the exiles that they're trying to protect, because they showed up to begin with at a time when we weren't really equipped or very resourceful. And so if we join with them and build more connection with them, I can still have a planner or a part of me that tries to scan the situation to see what could go wrong. But it can live in very close relationship with myself, that knows that basically I am equipped to deal with just about anything. And if things do go wrong, I know how to ask for help or to get safe. And so knowing that, I can do the worrying or the planning from a much more equanimous, calm, clear, confident place. And it tends to work much better for the people around me and also for me. So just that idea that our protectors tend to be young as well as our exiles are young is helpful. So anyway, to go back to the steps, we try to get to know a protector, understand what it's doing, what its job is, what it's trying to protect us from, and then at some point we can ask its permission to work with the exile. And in some ways, I often think of the exile not so much as a totally different part, but almost as the root system of the protector, that the protector behavior has at its roots a trauma, and that trauma needs to be addressed and resolved for us to change the protector, so that it's not so burdened with this belief that the world is dangerous or that we're under-equipped or whatever that is. But regardless of whether you think of it as a whole different part that you're working with or an aspect of the protector, you want to make sure that the protector is okay with you working with the vulnerability before you do that. So you get permission from the protector to work with the exile, and then you work with the exile in a very similar way of getting to know it and helping it feel understood and appreciated, and then bringing your self energy to it to help it heal by kind of expressing care and that kind of thing. So let me just go through this with the handout, because I think it will be a little clearer if you can look at it. So can people see that? Do you see a picture of a woman pointing her finger? Okay. So this is the first step. Is there's kind of 5 steps to kind of getting connected with the protector. So first you have to access the part. And that's not necessarily easy to do, because you want to access it experientially. It's not enough to just say, oh, I have this worrier part, but I actually need to feel what it feels like in my body when I'm worried. I need to get in touch with what I'm believing when I'm worried. What are the images, how I see the world, what I'm thinking about the world. And so when you're trying to help a client access a part, you can just, if they just say, oh, I'm just so neurotic with my kids, or I get so critical of my kids, you want them to like maybe remember a recent time when they were critical with their kids and see if they can remember, like just maybe close their eyes and imagine that they're in that situation. And then just notice, what were they saying and doing? What were they believing about their kids or about themselves? What were they feeling in their body? What kind of emotions were they feeling? And what kind of sensations were they feeling? And so,
Susie,
yeah,
do you want them to, having them actually activated feel like?
yeah, you want to activate it a little bit. So you want them to be in experiential contact with it and not just intellectualizing about it. Just like with EMDR, when you're trying to help a person process a trauma, it's like you need to open the door to the disturbing experience enough that then they're going to be able to do the processing in a way that they're making contact with a real thing and not just staying in an intellectual level. Because if you just do it on this intellectual level, it doesn't take. Just like, anytime we can think we solved the problem logically, rationally, we decided we don't need to be dependent anymore, but then next time we get triggered, we're just as dependent as we ever were, or something. So yeah, you want to activate it enough, but then the next step is to unblend from it. And so this is the interesting thing, is you want it to both be activated and not totally blended with your whole experience of yourself. So unblending means that if I'm unblended from a part, I'm not seeing the world through the part's perspective. I'm not totally, my identity is not captured by the part anymore. And so the way that we help a person unblend from a part is that we have them just ask the part if it would be willing to separate. So for example, if I was working with a mom who was very critical of her children, and she described how when she gets that way, she feels her teeth are clenched, she feels like they're being like brats, she has this idea that she needs to call them out on it and confront them, and she's like kind of somewhat activated as she's noticing this and describing this. Then I say, okay, I want you to take that critical part that's all revved up about needing to, confront your children. I want you to take it and ask it if it would be willing to give you a little bit of space, to just separate from you a little bit. And that let that part know that you're not trying to get rid of it and you're not going to forget about it, but you want to really understand it. You want to deeply understand what its concerns are and what it's about, and maybe help it. And in order to do that, you can't be flooded by it. So ask it if it can give you enough space that you can actually listen and be there for it. And it's surprising how often just asking the person to ask the part if it's willing to do that, the person goes, okay, yeah, it's willing to. And they actually take a breath or sigh or something, kind of tells you that they've been able to actually imagine that the part is not their whole being. They no longer identify with the part, and that they're kind of externalizing the part. Sometimes I'll give them more help if they're having trouble, like, picture how old it is, and could you put it in the chair in front of you? Or sometimes if they can actually give it a physical identity, like it's a little girl part, or it's a teenager, or it's when I first had the kids, it feels like it's my 30-year-old self, but somehow that they want to put that part in the chair in front of them. If the part won't go, it's holding on tight, it's good to kind of understand why it doesn't want to give you space. And so sometimes parts think that if they give you space, you're going to do this thing that you shouldn't do, like you're going to let your children get away with hell, or you're going to get walked on they're going to walk all over you. And so you want to reassure the part, I'm not going to let the children walk all over me. You can come back as soon as you need to, as soon as I'm around my children again, but I'm here in the session with Susie or Megan, Veronica, and I just want to understand you better. Can you give me some space? And so you kind of negotiate with the part, but reassure it. If it has concerns, you hear the concerns, you appreciate the concerns, and you let it know that you can recognize that it's trying to help you, and that you recognize it has some real value and merit, but you just want to help understand it better and maybe help it. And if that doesn't work, another strategy you can use, and you could just ask the person to step back from the part. So the part's not willing to step back. You can say, okay, let's just imagine that you're stepping back a little and you're putting the part into a room, or you're seeing the part as smaller than it was, or you're going back into a safe place that you know that you feel really safe. So you can kind of invite the person to find self energy by doing a meditation or grounding, or just picturing themselves as a little bit removed from the part. And so that's another way of doing it. It's like the two options are asking the part to step back, or helping the person to step back from the part. But either way, you want some space. And one way then you can check for that is you then ask them, how do you feel towards the part now? Because if they say, yeah, okay, it's a little bit separated, you can say, okay, so when you're looking at it in front of you, or I don't have images of the visuals that I can see inside my head the way some people can. And I guess a certain percentage of people don't. And so it doesn't like work when people say, when you look at the part, how does it look? But I have a sense of the part being separate. And so you check, how do you feel towards that part now? And if the person feels compassion or curiosity or calmness, they're probably in self. But if the person starts telling you they feel the same thing that the part felt, like, I feel like my children are a disaster and I need to figure out how to contain them, then they're still in the part. Or if they feel critical towards the part, that's called a concerned part. So if they feel something other than compassion towards the part, there's another part showing up, and that part might, like if I try to tend to my worry part and I separate from it, and then someone says, how do you feel towards the worry? And I say, I'm just so disappointed. It's stolen so much of my life from me. I'm just so frustrated with how it creates a veil between me and joy all the time. And that's not self. That's a part that's feeling discouraged, or is mad, or has another thing. And so we have to help unblend from the concern part. So now this is where it gets a little complicated sometimes, is to clear enough space for the person to be able to show up for their original part with self. And so, like in my case, all I need to do is understand the concern of the concerned part. So if I have a part that says, I'm so pissed at that worrying, it's just cost me so much joy and calmness. And then if I can just say, of course, it makes sense that I'm pissed at it. It makes sense that I want it to shift. But the best way to help it is not to attack it. The best way I'm going to be able to help it is to understand it. And so is that kind of anger at the part willing to step aside, or even not step aside, but will it soften if I express understanding? Can it soften a little and let me show up for the part with a different kind of energy? So that's basically when a concerned part shows up. I find that if you can just affirm it, show that you understand it, reassure it that you're not going to forget about its concern, often then it will soften and kind of move aside a little bit, so that then when you look at the part again, like the worry, and you say, how do you feel towards it? You say, I'm just feel really sad for it. I can see how much stress it's under, and how hard it works, and how tired it must be. I just feel compassion for it. So it might not be compassion they feel, but they might just feel curious about it, curious why it thinks it has to be there all the time, or whatever. So then once you've cleared enough space, once you've unblended and from the target part and also from the concerned parts, that's when you can get to know the protector. And you really just want to ask it questions like, what's your job? Why are you there? What are you concerned about? How do you think you're helping me? And then that kind of key question of, what are you afraid would happen if you stopped doing your job? And so my worrier thinks if it stopped doing its job, I would basically become untethered to life and go floating off out in space without any oxygen or something. It has a strange idea that worrying is what keeps it, holds it to something secure. So what is it? So then you just kind of appreciate it. There's a lot of building your relationship with the protector, where you're letting it know that you appreciate the job it's done, But a big part of that is helping the protector know that you're there. And so sometimes in parts therapy, you ask the person, how does the part see you there with it? Can it sense you're with it? Can it hear that you appreciate it? Is it feeling, how old does it think you are? Does it get it that you're an adult? Because sometimes the part pictures you as the exile. So my worrier is going to assume that I'm this little girl that it needs to worry about and protect. And if for it to kind of recognize that, no, I'm actually this adult Susie that can show up for it, takes a little bit of reminding. So those are the first steps. And then, I'm sorry, did someone have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question if you
Yeah,
don't
go
mind.
ahead, please.
Okay, so just for clarity, I understand you're like accessing the part, you're activating the part to some degree, and then you're asking for permission to kind of separate from the part just a little bit. And then the way that you want to be able to really confirm, for lack of a better word, that the person is not as activated and living in that protector part is by asking how you feel towards it. And the hope is to kind of have them uh, utilize one of the 8 C's to some degree. I mean, not necessarily word for word, but to use a way of thinking of it like that. If you're noticing that they're still critical about it or trying to figure it out, then that is them kind of being in a concerned role or concerned part, and you don't want to stop there. You want to help them kind of come out of that concerned place and into that place of one of those 8 C's, so that there's like that little bit of awareness and compassion and curiosity about it, but they're not like as in it and also not critical of it.
Exactly. Great summary. And I can send you this kind of like these steps with a little bit of a couple sentences after each step to help you remind you about that. But also, gosh, something you just said, I can't remember what it was. There was something else I was going to say, but I just lost it. Felt important. Oh, well. I think that so much of the process is, oh, I know what I was going to say. I sometimes think of it the way that if you are working with a parent and a child in a session, and you're trying to get the parent to show up for their child, that you wouldn't want the parent to be attacking the child, but nor once they kind of, what the way that you would want them to relate to the child, to be helpful to the child, would be out of compassion or calmness or curiosity. And it's not going to help if they switch from attacking the child to switch to caretaking the child or rescuing the child or being afraid of the child or appeasing the child. You want them to be in core self, because that's what's going to help them be most helpful to their child. So it's very similar. The part is just like a child, and that you're not going to be able to interact with it in a therapeutic, healthy parenting way if you're not in core self. So once you kind of get to know a protector in that way, these are kind of pictures of different protectors, like a critical scolder or a timekeeper or a busy kind of person, or I don't know what that's supposed to be, judgmental or something. So anyway, then there's the steps continue, and but that process of getting to know the part, the protector might be enough to really shift things a lot. But once you have gotten to know the protector, you can get its permission to work with the exile. So when you ask that question of what are you afraid would happen if you weren't doing your job, and they say, I'm afraid I would just be so alone, and you learn a little bit about how alone they felt when that part first came along. And then you could say, I think that we might be able to help that part with those lonely feelings. Maybe if we could heal those lonely feelings, or kind of help the part know that we were taking care of that wounded part. Do you think the part would like that? And if the part says, yeah, go ahead if you can help that part. But the part might say, don't touch that stuff. It's way too dangerous. It'll overwhelm me. I'll get flooded. We can't do it. And so you need to just kind of listen to the part and the protector And if it tells you it's not ready, you need to work with that and understand what would help it to, what reassurances does it need to know that you're ready. You know, one big reassurance it needs is that you have strategies to not let an exile overwhelm you, so that when you work with the old trauma, you're not going to get so flooded that you're going to dissociate or become destructive with yourself or with other people or something. So then you go through a similar 5 steps with the exile, if you've gotten permission to work with it, where you access it experientially, you remember a time that you felt it, but then you try to unblend from it. It's a little harder with exiles to do the unblending because the feelings tend to be really raw and overwhelming. And you have to like let the exile know that that it's okay that it feels its feelings and you want to be there for it, but you want there to be a you that's there for it, as opposed to it just totally consuming your whole identity. And then you're checking also for concerned parts. Often there are parts that are very critical of the wounded child, because that was one of the ways that we all learned to cope with our pain, is to hide it, or, you know, treat ourselves like we shouldn't be whiners, or that we're being wimps or whatever. And then once we have gotten in self, we want to learn all about the exile and begin to build a trusting relationship with the exile. And ultimately, the ways that we heal the exile are through witnessing. Oops, we lost Megan. Let her back in. Witnessing the childhood origins of it, and just kind of understanding how it developed. Reparenting, which means just giving the exile the kind of parenting that it needed, like letting it know it's not bad, or that it's doing the best it can, or that you're going to keep it safe, or anything like that. Retrieving is more like asking the exile if it would like to come into the present moment with you, rather than living in the past, because our exiles very much think the past is still happening. And it can be very helpful to kind of let that lost little part to know that actually you survived and you're okay, and you live in this current body and this current life, and you know how to be safe and strong. And so it might like to come with you. Did someone have a question? And then unburdening is kind of a process where you're like specifically going through a ritual of letting go of the beliefs that that the exile had, that it's unworthy of love, or that the world is dangerous, or whatever that is. And then ultimately you go back to the protector and help it see that you've done a lot to heal the exile, and that maybe the protector now can let go of a little bit of its rigidity and shift its role a little, you know, so that my worrier can stop being such a doom and gloom worry, and it turn more into a planner, kind of an upbeat planner, or something. That is like a different role once it's not so worried about this terrible thing that's going to happen that actually isn't going to happen. So that's the whole process, just described very quickly. And you don't usually go through that whole process at once. You usually do little pieces of it. Let me stop the share and come back together and see what kind of questions are up for people. So what kind of questions are up for people?
I'm curious what integration would look like, just, and I don't mean the whole process, but like an idea. What's an example of integrating in this? I know what integration means in other things, and so I kind of have just like
for the last step that I just
Yeah.
referenced.
Mhm.
Yeah. So like if I did a lot to kind of heal little lost Susie, to help her know that she's no longer living back there, that actually she's safe, and actually I have resources, and it was never about her being unlovable. It was just about having a busy mom. And I've done most of that kind of healing stuff with that part of me. Then I go back to the worrier and I say, did you see what the work that I just did with that exile? Do you see that little lost part knows that it's safe now? And knowing that it's safe and that it has a lot more resource than it used to, do you still feel like you need to do the same job of worrying? Is there anything that's different for you? Could you imagine, like maybe imagining a situation like the one that you were imagined at the beginning when the worry was triggered? Like I had my worrier come up recently when my sister was going to come into town last week, And I was just noticing, I was just always worried, like, do we have a good enough plan? Do we have the right groceries? Are we gonna have enough time with her, meeting my grandsons? Is it gonna be too hot? And I was just being like a negative Nelly, or I was being in this yucky place. And so I was trying to do a little work with my worrier and kind of reminding her that that little part of me that thinks everything's going to go wrong and I'm going to end up feeling ashamed or unloved, or something bad's going to happen, I won't be equipped to handle it. Like, none of that is going to happen. I belong to my sister, she belongs to me. We know that if something doesn't go well, we'll figure out a solution. Like, I could know all that, and then I could come back to the worrier and say, do you get that? And then the worry gets different. It like becomes more, again, like me making some lists of things we need to do. And actually what I shifted it to was just noticing all the positive intentions I had for her visit, and just recognizing, oh, I really want her to have fun food, or I want her to have enough time with the grandchildren. But it didn't feel so negative. It just felt more like a positive interest. So that was the worrier getting integrated with the fact that disaster isn't right around the corner, like it was thinking. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So what other questions are up for people? Because I think the next thing I was picturing is just doing a little demonstration with you guys and having you just imagine going through this a little bit with a part, just so you could experience it.
I have a question that I think you've been kind of actually answering when you're answering some of Doozy's questions, but it seems to me that the forgiveness part is sort of an essential component, and maybe a tricky area, because if you're accessing a part, even becoming aware of a part that was either a protector, or if you get to the point of an exile part, since they are originating from trauma, there can be so much shame and guilt associated with that, whether it's a protector part or whether it's an exile part. And it seems that forgiveness is an essential step to understanding, just being able to sit with it and explore that. So I just, do you have any thoughts on that? How to move through that forgiveness stage?
Forgiving the protector for the trouble it's caused you, or forgiving?
I feel like forgiveness is going to be an essential part of an essential component of understanding any of those parts.
Yeah.
This is protector. I think that understanding if the protector has become extreme, for instance, having forgiveness for that extreme reaction that is trying to cope with something, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you get past that and you're talking about actual exile parts, and you're having conversations, internal conversations with the exile part. That was a reaction from trauma as well. And so being able to forgive that part of you that was so hurt or is doing a trauma reaction, it just seems like forgiveness is an essential component to being to move to understanding.
Yeah, I think that the word forgive is not the one I usually use, but I think it's a good stand-in for the same idea. I would more use that you want to understand that it makes perfect sense that the part is the way it is, you know, whether it's an exile or a protector, like, of course, I understand what you've been trying to accomplish, or I understand what you went through that made you feel this way. And then also appreciation. Like, I get it that your intention is to help me. Like, that would be an appreciation of the protector. With the exile, there's not so much to appreciate, because it's not so much an action-oriented part. It's just a feeling part. And so it's much more of like, I understand, it makes sense to me. And then it's like trying to offer a corrective emotional experience with it. Like, that's what they call reparenting. Like, just that this was never your fault. I, of course, understand why you feel so ashamed, but this was your mom's responsibility, not yours. And she was doing the best she could. She came from a long chain of trauma, and I'm so sorry that that's happening, but you don't need to feel ashamed of any of it. And so that's like the message that myself can give to the part. That's kind of like forgiveness, whether you call it forgiveness or compassion or understanding or appreciation. All of those things are just that we want the part to feel deeply understood and validated, that it makes sense, and that we can appreciate what it's about. And I think that leads to forgiveness, just like if we have a perpetrator and we understand what led them to do what they did, that leads us to be more forgiving with them, because we can appreciate that they were they were confused or hurt or whatever that was. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's just go ahead and do this. I'm going to do like about a 15-minute guided meditation with you, 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can debrief from it and talk about how it goes. And I think I'll just put my face on the screen for that part. Yeah, I think if I just put it into speaker view, no, actually that's not working. Let's see, that's not going to work. Let's try a different thing. I know, why don't we just have all of you turn off your videos, so that, because I just want you not to feel like you're being watched as you're doing this. And so I'm going to guide you through this, and you can just close off your videos, and it will take about 10 minutes. And I might close my eyes while I do it too. Sometimes it helps me to guide people through the meditation if I imagine I'm doing it at the same time. I took some notes, so I might look at them, but I also mostly am going to wing it to take you through a process of mostly just getting to know a part and appreciating it. So yeah, let's start with having you all just close your eyes and get a little bit grounded in yourself, and in that sense of just kind of like a mindfulness moment of grounding, like just noticing your breath, maybe taking some deeper, more expansive breaths into your belly, and seeing if you can feel your shoulders relax and let go of any unnecessary tension in your body. Maybe just feeling the contact points of your seat against your chair or whatever surface you're sitting on, and feeling your feet grounded. Just noticing that you're safe right now. Hopefully you're in a space that you feel pretty safe and whole, and that you're just in a space where you can do a little bit of connecting with some of the parts that are inside of you. And let me just put out a caveat that, or a disclaimer, or something that a lot of times when I do guided meditations, I talk through the process pretty quickly. And if I was doing this with a client, I would be moving more slowly and checking with them periodically to see where they were at, and making sure I was tailoring whether we're going on or not, with whether they were ready to, or how we might shift it. And so I'm not going to be doing any of that. So it might feel a little bit like I'm just bulldozing along and you get lost in the process. And if that happens, don't worry about it. Just think of this more as me demonstrating a meditation that you're not actually doing if you can't do it, but try to do it with us. And don't be hard on yourself if you can't keep up, or the images aren't coming, or the conversation isn't happening in the way that I'm inviting it to happen. So just beginning from this kind of grounded, hopefully somewhat relaxed place, turning your attention inward and just imagining that you're searching inside of your body and your whole internal system for a part, or maybe a whole cluster of parts that would kind of like some attention. So this is sometimes a way I start a session if people don't have something they want to focus on, is just to kind of close their eyes and notice what needs attention, what part of me needs attention right now. And it might be that there is a feeling of disturbance or something that you're struggling with that needs your attention, that you could kind of name as a part. And it might be also that you just have an idea that there's a part that shows up a lot in your life that has caused you some trouble, that maybe is a little bit rigid or extreme, or just intense, and that you'd like to give it some attention. So just noticing what part needs my attention, and seeing if you can find a part. It doesn't have to be, probably better if it's not the most vulnerable part you have or the most difficult part you have, but just some little part that has gotten aggravated recently, maybe. And we're going to begin by helping you to access it. And so, yeah, this is you actually getting a little activated, of just remembering the most recent time you felt it. And so just imagining a situation where that part gets triggered. And it might be that you have to like, like I have a part that used to get triggered by my father-in-law. And so all I need to do is picture a time when he was over for dinner, and I can kind of feel that part that used to feel a little bit bulldozed or ridiculed or angry in response to that. So I could think of it as I'll just make up a name for him, like my Roger reaction part, So I just know that part is kind of just it's a cluster of a lot of feelings, but it's one that comes up reliably in that situation. So just noticing if there's the part that you've picked, and seeing if you can picture the situation that recently or long ago got triggered in, and noticing what the sensations are that go with it, what kinds of emotions you feel when that part is activated, what kinds of thoughts you have about yourself or about other people. Maybe there's an image of a scene or an image of, it could be just be like an image of a spinning vortex of whatever. Like I know when I think about my worry part, I just picture this drawing of a gingerbread man where the gingerbread man is just gone, is vibrating kind of. So just thinking of just whatever image goes with that part, and also what sensations in your body. So when you think about that part, do you get, constrictions in your chest or throat, or some kind of activation that happens in your body? And it might be that you can kind of get a felt sense of the part, like it feels heavy, or it feels sticky, or it feels dark, or it feels bottomless, or, feels like vibration. So just really getting in touch with the part. And now the next step is, once it's activated a little bit, to unblend from it. And so you're just going to ask the part if it's willing to separate from you, and just let it know that you don't want to make it go away. You understand that it's got important things that it needs you to understand, or that it wants to protect you from, and that you just are wanting to help it understand it more deeply, show up for it, and that you can't really do that unless it's willing to not overwhelm you or kind of glom onto you. It's kind of like you're trying to save a drowning person, and you can't save them if they've got you in a neck grip and they're dunking you underwater, that you just need a little bit of space to be able to pull them to shore. And so just picturing that you're asking this part if it's willing to step back a little so that you can help it, and that you're not going to desert it, that you're there to show up for it, and see if the part is willing to separate a little. I would say about 80% of the time, parts are just willing to do that. But if it's not willing, you might just find out why it's afraid to give you space. And if it's able to tell you, it's afraid you're going to desert it, or it's afraid you're going to do this other thing. Maybe it's a very controlling part, and it's afraid that without it's the controlling, you're going to start binge eating or go run somebody over, or something. And so just to let it know that you're going to be, very careful not to do the thing that it's afraid you're going to do. And also, if it starts seeing you behaving in a way that looks out of control or dangerous or something, it can step back in. You're not putting it in prison. You're just asking it to give you a little bit of space. It can be on standby. So hopefully the part's willing to step back a little. And now we just want to check to see how you feel towards it. So just noticing as you're there with the part in front of you, whether it's sitting in a chair or just some image that's off to the side. It might look like a little person, or it might look like a shape or an animal, or it helps if you can get an image of it. Just how do you feel towards it? Just noticing how you feel towards it, and seeing if one of those words like compassionate or calm or curious shows up. And if something very different shows up, like I hate that part, or I'm scared of that part, or I need that part, just some other feeling, just label that as a concern part. Okay, that part is concerned. It's concerned about your relationship with the original part. It either wants more of it or less of it, but it's concerned. It has an agenda. It's got a pony in the race, or whatever you call that. And so you want to check with the concerned part about what its concern is and reassure it that you're not going to forget about that concern, that that concern makes sense, that you see the sense in it and that you appreciate that and that you're not going to forget about that, but you're asking the concerned part if it's willing to give you a little space or soften a little so that you can show up with more self for the target part. You're just seeing if you can negotiate or kind of get a little bit of that kind of space from the concern part as well as from the original target part. And this is the part of the process that sometimes takes several attempts. Like it might be a new concern shows up. When you get one out of the way, another one shows up. And so don't be hard on yourself if you can't find self energy towards the original target part. But if you can, and it might be just remembering about a part of your life where you can show up with self. Maybe it's with your pet or with nature or with the child, like that, or as a therapist, that what it's like to be in self, and to see if you can claim that position of selfness and relate to the part from that place. So just being now hopefully in self and seeing how you feel towards the part, and beginning to get to know the part a little. So just ask the part, or sense into the part to try to understand what's its concerns, what it's trying to accomplish, what it's about, kind of what does it see its role is in your system? What's it trying to help you do or help make sure doesn't happen? Just really checking to see, what it believes about your life, what its goals are, and what it needs some help. And then asking it that important question of what is it afraid would happen if it stopped doing its job? And it might be that before you even want to ask that question, and I'm realizing I shouldn't have asked it yet, is that you just want to make sure the part knows that you appreciate it, that you're just letting it know that you really appreciate that it has good intentions. And sometimes it's just appreciating how hard that part works, because some of our protector parts work so hard. They're like on alert 24/7. And that just to appreciate that it's trying to do a really hard job to keep you safe in the way that it thinks it needs to, and that you understand that and appreciate its efforts. Even if it's caused you a lot of trouble and there's ways that it doesn't do its job very well, you appreciate that it's trying really hard. It's like a little child is trying really hard to be helpful to you to get the kitchen clean, but it keeps messing up the kitchen or something. It's trying, and it needs you to appreciate how hard it's trying. And so then to ask it what it's afraid would happen if it stopped doing its job, and to see if it's able to kind of let you know a little bit about a kind of deeper vulnerability that it's afraid would happen, that maybe it's remembering what it was like when it couldn't protect you from something, that it really doesn't want you to feel a certain feeling that it sees as unbearable or overwhelming, or it really doesn't want you to have to go through a thing that you went through in the past that was not fun at all. It was really hard on you. So just see if the part's able to kind of let you know what that is, and just appreciating if it is letting you know that, just appreciating that there's some stuff that's happened in the past that makes this part think that it needs to be really extreme, and that makes it feel like it needs to be on lookout or needs to be very active. Or there's some stuff that's happened in the past that it's still afraid is going to happen now, which might be true. It might be still, you might still be vulnerable to some of that hard stuff happening. Chances are you're not nearly as vulnerable as you were. And chances are if that stuff happened now, you'd be much more equipped to deal with it. So just appreciating the part for the job it's doing, and kind of noticing, like maybe when that part first started, like what happened that made it need to be so whatever it is. And just appreciating that, of course, It was the best strategy that you could come up with at the time. You didn't have a lot of resource, you came up with the best strategy that fit the very best with the situation that you were in. It might not fit anymore, but it was the best thing you could come up with at the time. Your system was trying really hard to figure out a way to stay safe. And just appreciating that that happened. But if you want, you might try updating the part a little bit, just letting it know that you're there now and that's not happening anymore. And maybe that's not going to happen again, or if it does, you'll be much more equipped. But seeing if the part can feel the difference between who you are now and who you were back then when the trauma originally happened. Seeing if the part can feel the difference, that you're actually an adult person who has a lot of skills and resources, a lot of perspective that you didn't have back then. And maybe in general, you're a lot safer than you were back then. So we're just kind of like trying to update the part a little bit about the ways that life has changed and that you've survived and that you're whole. Because the part just is still very attached to kind of that trauma story and the trauma beliefs. And to whatever extent the part's been able to feel your presence, you might just thank it for letting you make contact with it. And just thank all the other parts that have maybe been willing to soften or step to the side to let you do that. And you can kind of let your parts know. Sometimes good to notice if there's any new part that's kind of showing up that's really concerned about the contact you just made. Because sometimes a new part shows up that's very worried and you might need to reassure it a little bit. And some of the reassurance might be that you know how to take care of yourself if you've been a little activated by this, that you know how to settle your nervous system, reach out to a friend, or do something that helps you feel confident, it's safe. But I think it can also be helpful to let all the parts that you feel connected to right now know that you can come back and make contact with them again, that you're interested in continuing to build trust with them and help them to work together in a system that's more updated. And so just kind of wrapping up by thanking all those parts that let you get to know them a little bit. And when you're ready, maybe turning your screens back on so we can kind of talk about how that was. And I would encourage you, if you have paper and a pen in front of you, just to make a few notes about like what the part was that you began to identify. And if you had some insight about it, like maybe you discovered something that it feels and thinks that you didn't realize before, or maybe you recognize some way that it was related to something in the past you didn't realize it was related to. Just make a couple notes on a piece of paper so that you don't lose those as we're having the conversation. But what I would like to just talk about is kind of any thoughts people had about what was helpful about that or confusing about that. And you're welcome to bring up your own content if you want to talk about the stuff that showed up for you and any insights or confusions or next steps you're wondering about. But you can also just ask about the process or comment on the process. And obviously we just moved through a whole lot of the steps in a very little amount of time. And so it was kind of a rushing along process. So what kinds of things, what kind of questions do people have or thoughts?
A brief thought I just have is that the part that I chose to, there was a recent experience that made this an easy exercise to do. And also it was a part of myself that has been under a lot of examination. So that kind of just made the whole process started. And still, I found the idea of acceptance and appreciation for what the protector was trying to do and what that was related to as far as an exile part of me, was actually comforting, because there was, prior to this, there was some residual guilt around, like, I'm still doing that, I'm still
Right.
experience. I thought I was way past that, blah blah
Right.
blah.
We can treat our parts with so much judgment and ridicule, and that's nice that you got in touch with a little bit more appreciation and a little bit more forgiveness of yourself. That's lovely. That's lovely. It reminds me of Carl Jung has that quote that what we resist persists, and that it's so easy to resist, just to be mad at ourselves for our behaviors that continue to be rigid or dysfunctional, instead of meeting them with more appreciation and understanding and curiosity. What else are people noticing? Or questions? Or frustrations?
I appreciate the experiential part, kind of bringing in all of the concepts and the parts together. And throughout it, kind of like giving that part of me space that kind of is like, this is so much like Jungian therapy as well. And honoring that, this is the part, this is a great like structure for it, and a great way that's accessible. And also that this is something, this is kind of like an infusion of so many practices that have been around for so long. And
Well
yeah.
said. I feel that way too. It's like, for me, it's like externalizing a narrative. It's like self-compassion therapy, which is helping us show up for ourselves with self-compassion. But this one has so much more of a structure for it, that it kind of helps you recognize what's getting in the way of me showing up with self-compassion, and what exactly it is to show compassion, how does that look? So yeah, it interweaves, and then obviously all that somatic experiencing stuff and focusing stuff that comes out of just learning how to tune into what we're experiencing and sensing. What else are people noticing or wondering about?
I think it reminded me of the importance, like, I felt like I got a little bit stuck in this stuff. Maybe I went in a little bit too serious with mine or something, and I got stuck in the spot of being really critical. And so I just kind of checked out a little bit and stopped doing it. But
Yeah.
just a reminder of like the importance of supporting somebody through that kind of like activation space and going
Yeah.
slow with the process if
Yeah.
they're stuck in it. And it helped me to understand a little more when you were talking about like, don't jump right into this part, because you got to make sure this part's doing this thing, and just recognizing the value of it in that tiny experience that I had.
I so appreciate you sharing that place that you got a little hijacked by the critical part and that you couldn't get past it. And did you try to like appreciate that the criticism made sense, or that you?
Nope. Nope.
Yeah.
I actually was just kind of mad and frustrated.
Right.
And then
So then you got mad at the critical part. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's kind of useful to kind of think with each thing that shows up, even though it's interfering, that the first thing is to say, oh, of course you're critical of that part of me. It's caused a lot of trouble. I appreciate that you want life to be different than that. And that makes sense. But I'm not going to really help this part if we're just pounding it over the head with how bad it is. So are you willing to soften? But yeah. So that's, yeah, a good note. I think that's really helpful, because when we have a judgmental part or a critical part, or my thing is I just get distracted and dissociate and can't, like, I lose track of the fact that I'm doing the exercise, and then I get really mad at myself. And it's hard to even have enough focus to figure out, to thank the dissociated part that it thought I was going to get overwhelmed and it needed to just take me offline. This is why it's so helpful to have a therapist with you, guiding you, because they can help you.
Yeah, and to also remember that what we just did in 20 minutes sometimes can be 6 sessions.
Exactly.
Right? Like, of just like really providing that space for somebody to kind of be stuck in their stuff. And yeah, it was just a good reminder.
No, thank you for saying that. I think that a lot of times, like, I've gradually been building up more of a relationship with some of my parts by revisiting them, and they begin to get to know that there is a self by that revisiting, and so that I'm I understand them better, but they also feel me. They feel my presence better. So it's much easier for me when they come up in the moment to make contact with them and like, oh, hello, warrior. There you are. I'm here too. And that we can kind of make contact more quickly. All right, well, this is a lot. I flooded your brain with a lot. I'll send you those 2 handouts, the map of the internal system one, and there's something called the help sheet that goes through all the steps. And it's kind of similar to the one that had the graphics of the person pointing, all of that, but it has a little bit of a sentence about each step so that might help you. But obviously we can kind of think together about what part 2 of this training might look like and how to keep helping you with this. So I'm excited to share more about this model with you and to think about your cases using it and stuff.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you, Susie.
right, take
Super
care, you
helpful.
guys. See you in a couple weeks, I think. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.